Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 77 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Brandon Sanderson, author of such fantasy novels as Mistborn, The Way of Kings, and Alcatraz and the Evil Librarians. He was also selected to finish Robert Jordan's epic fantasy series The Wheel of Time, following Jordan's death in 2007. The 14th and final book in the series, A Memory of Light, is out now.
Then stick around after the interview as guest geek Douglas Cohen joins us to discuss Robert E. Howard movie adaptations.
Alright, so let's get to our interview. Alright, so we're here with Brandon Sanderson. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Alright, so as we're recording this, the release of A Memory of Light is just days away. So what will you be doing on the day that the book comes out?
Well, I'll probably be sleeping at first because the night before I'll be doing a midnight release party, and those tend to go pretty late. And then I will be flying, I believe, to Minneapolis is the first stop, and I will be doing a signing there that evening.
Well, so tell us about the midnight release party.
For quite a while now, my fans have wanted me to do midnight releases, and so what we do is we pick a bookstore. It's been BYU bookstore for a while since it's the only local independent in Provo, and we will go there, and I will pre-sign all the books to make it easy on people, and then we have a party. At midnight, we start selling the book. People can grab their book and take off with it, or they can come and wait in the extremely long line to get it personalized by me. We do number the books at the release party, which is also kind of fun.
And Robert Jordan's widow will be there, right?
Yes, Harriet's coming for the first time. She's going to come on down, and we're going to have her sign all the books too. We'll do like a Q&A reading thing beforehand, and then Harriet's going to go back to the hotel and go to bed while I sit around and sign books until 5 a.m.
So are people camped out on the sidewalks already?
Yes, they are. Indeed. Someone really wanted book number 1, and so he came, I think, a good 2 weeks early and started camping. So, I mean, it's not particularly pleasant outside in Utah in December and January, so these are real troopers.
Have you been over there to bring them hot chocolate or anything?
I haven't yet. I usually stop by once or twice during the lines, but I have not stopped by as of yet. I live a lot further from BYU than I used to.
So, I think a lot of fantasy and science fiction fans have kind of grown suspicious about whether and how long-running series are going to end. And I think a lot of people are probably wondering, is this really the end of The Wheel of Time?
Well, the honest truth is I don't get to say. It's Harriet's story now. It's not mine. Harriet and I have talked about it, and both of us feel that this should be the ending. The last thing that Robert Jordan wrote is the last chapter of this book. I don't think that Robert Jordan would have wanted us to go further, and I think that going on to do some of the other things would, it would be too much of me having to take over, where for these last books that were really just one book in his notes, I've been able to follow his outline fairly closely. And yes, there were holes and things like this and things I had to do, but I had an ending in sight. That target, which was the ending that he'd written, has guided me all along, and that kept it in the realm of being his story that I'm writing rather than my story that I'm taking over.
But you think people are going to be satisfied that this pretty much ties up most of the loose ends and there's not a huge cliffhanger at the end or anything like that?
Yeah. I mean, I felt when I first read it, it was a satisfying ending. I felt it was the right ending. It's been my guidepost for the entire work that I've done on this. I mean, there are going to be some holes. Robert Jordan told fans before he passed away that he didn't want everything wrapped up neatly with a bow. And so, there's no major cliffhangers, but there are some indications of things that happen after the series, things that continue on. And he had planned to write a sequel trilogy, and people are aware of that. And so naturally there are going to be holes regarding some of the characters he was planning to put in that trilogy.
So what if somebody wants to know how the story ends, but they don't want to read all 14 books? Could they jump straight into this one, or would it make any sense at all, or would they just be lost?
Boy, I would really not suggest that. If people wanted to jump in, the place that I would suggest jumping in would be book 11, which is the last one Robert Jordan wrote, which is the one that really kind of starts to take the focus toward an end game. And so if there's Wheel of Time fans out there that read the first few books and then, said, oh, I'll finish it when the series is done and things like that, 11 might be a good place to come back into it. That one's called Knife of Dreams.
So I heard that one chapter in this book is around 50,000 words long and contains 70 to 80 point of view characters. Is that true?
It's actually a bit longer than that, but it has fewer viewpoint characters. I think it's like 70 or 80,000 words. And there are around 70 viewpoint shifts, but there are a lot of repeated viewpoints. And so, yes, there's this massive chapter. It's one of the things I planned from the beginning. And like a lot of things that I tried that are kind of a little bit out of the mainstream for the series, I pitched it to Harriet and said, here's why I think it would work and why I think it'll be a great chapter. And she went ahead and let me get away with it, as she frequently did in working on these. And so, yeah, there's a big, awesome, meaty, long chapter at the end of the book. It's not the last chapter. It's one of the last chapters, though.
And I heard you say that this book contains a lot of big battles, and that since you're not a big military history buff like Robert Jordan was, that you needed some help with those sections. And I was just kind of curious, who did you consult with, and what sort of details did they give you?
Well, Harriet is friends with Bernard Cornwell, and went to him for a bunch of advice on this. And so we used him as kind of a military expert. And also, Robert Jordan had two assistants. One of them is a military historian. He knows the military. He's been in the military, and those scenes were very heavily looked over and edited by him.
I imagine you must have just had to endure a lot of people being like, "Hey, man, you don't know Randall Thor, man," and just have you had to develop a thick skin for that? I mean,
yes and no. I mean, I was part of Wheel of Time fandom before I was given this project, so I know Wheel of Time fandom, if that makes sense. So when the Wheel of Time fans come and say, hey, they pick on pick certain characters, they'll say, like, it's usually Lan, or Matt. They'll say, hey, you don't know Lan. You don't know Lan. And, I do know Lan, and my interpretation of Lan differs from yours. And we could spend hours on forums discussing our different interpretations of characters. Nothing's changed from the time that I was just a fan to writing now. We would have had that same big, massive discussion on that forum back then as we talk about our different interpretations. And that's one of the factors people have to deal with in me picking up the series as a fan. I am going to bring my interpretation as a longtime fan of characters. And in some cases, they're spot on with what most people think. There haven't been many complaints at all about my Perrin, for instance. In some cases, there are complaints and they're right. My early Matt was off, and I acknowledge this. I looked at what the people were saying. In other cases, such as Lan, they're wrong. What can I say? I'm a fan too, and we will have these arguments about whether this character would do this or that character would do that, and you'll find that in any community. On the other hand, I do get complaints, and in some cases, the complaints are legit. I'm not Robert Jordan, and I can't do some of the things that he did simply because I don't have his life experience, and in many ways, I'm not as good a writer as he. I mean, he was a fantastic writer at the end of his career after having, grown and progressed for decades. And I'm a new writer. I've only been doing this for, 10, 15 years or so now. And so I'm not as skilled. And so in some cases, I just have to apologize and say, I just can't do it the way that he would do it. I have to try and do it the best way I know how to do it. But anyone who has gripes like that, they're legit gripes. And that's a good reason to just not like the books. And I'm fine with that. And if that really bothers you, then hopefully we can get the original notes released. That will be Harriet's decision. After the fact, I would like to release them so that those for whom my interpretation was not good or my failings ruined the experience for them, they can at least look at what Robert Jordan had and imagine their own story.
So I've heard that you have 50,000 unread emails in your inbox. And
yeah.
I just think, don't you worry about all the exciting business opportunities in Nigeria that you're missing out on?
Yeah, that's not even my spam box. I'm bad with email. I'm so bad with email. Fortunately, I do have people combing those inboxes, watching for important emails that come my way. And I try to read a lot of the fan mail. It's hard to answer it all, but I try to read it, at least. Social media has opened up all of this, and I love what social media has done. It creates this great connection between author and reader, which is wonderful, but it also means a lot more opportunities to do things other than writing, right? And it seems like the last thing I need in my life are more reasons to not be writing. And so I feel bad about that, but then I don't feel bad about that. And people who know me know that sometimes you have to send a dozen emails to actually get a hold of me. That's just part of the fact, part of dealing with a guy who spends most of his time trying to focus on the storytelling.
Okay, so I saw that you recently filmed yourself writing the opening prologue of your new novel, Stormlight. You want to tell us about that experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've talked about all of this stuff that goes on with social media and whatnot, and I like the interaction you can get. Some artists that I like, they're doing this thing where they'll film themselves painting a piece, and you get this awesome thing where you start with the blank page, and then you see in fast motion them painting the whole thing. Dan Dos Santos did this with the cover of Warbreaker, one of my novels. So you can actually find this sped up video of him painting the whole thing, and it's awesome. I can't do that with writing, right? It's not nearly as engaging to watch someone typing as it is to watch someone creating this amazing piece of art out of nothing. But I wanted to try and see what it was like. And so I picked a scene. It's not actually the prologue. It's just one of the scenes that won't be spoilery. I do these things called interludes in the Stormlight Archive, where I basically write short stories in the world and put them between major sections of the book. And I filmed is the wrong term, screen captured myself typing that out, starting with my little outline that I did for it, then typing the whole thing out, and then theoretically I will film myself doing the revisions. And the idea is just to put those things up as something fun that people might enjoy. Probably sped up a bunch since it took me 6 hours to write the scene. But yeah, it might be helpful to new writers. I don't know. It might be just a curiosity, but something I want to try.
Did that make you self-conscious at all, having that, knowing that people are going to be watching your process in action?
Yeah, it totally makes you self-conscious. Mostly it's the spelling. I'll be typing along and I'll see that I spelled some word wrong, and I'll be like, man, that's a word that, I should know how to spell that. And so I'll just use the little Microsoft Word spell check thing and stuff. But it does actually keep you focused, though, because every time your instinct is, I'm going to go check my email, or I'm going to go check this browser, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm filming. Probably should not do that. So that was nice.
So in an earlier episode, we were talking about how it seems like there's a disproportionately high number of Mormons who get into writing science fiction. Do you have any ideas about why that might be?
Oh, boy. I don't know. We all have our pet theories, right? I think it's probably, if you really looked at it, something pretty innocent, such as I bet you'll find that a disproportionately high number of Mormons are in all writing fields just because there's a high focus on literacy in the community. And so a lot of people end up writing. There's probably some confirmation bias going on, if that's the right term. You don't remember if somebody's a Jewish writer as much as if you remember if they're a Mormon writer. And so you start seeing us pop up all over the place. But, it is something we discuss. Is it real? I don't know if it's real. The other thing is that BYU does have a science fiction fantasy writing class that was started because of Orson Scott Card. He didn't actually end up teaching it the first time, but it was started because of him, and then he couldn't end up teaching it, so someone else took it over, and it's been going for now 20 plus years. And it could also just be the kind of, you see one successful person doing it, and it makes it that much easier for you to do it. Like, I got published in part because a writer came and taught that class while I was at BYU. This writer is Dave Wolverton, also writes under David Farland. He taught the class, and it was a real person who wrote, right, and was making a living at it. When everyone before had told me, yeah, you can't really make a living as a writer. And I saw somebody real doing it, and I said, I could do this too. So, those are lots of theories. Those are the theories from being on the inside and looking at it. I'm sure people who are on the outside can come up with lots more tongue-in-cheek reasons. I've read them myself and get a chuckle out of them.
Well, and you're actually teaching that writing class now, right?
Yeah, I'm teaching the writing class now. I took it over from Dave after he retired. There was one more teacher for a couple of years, and then I took it over. And I've been doing it for about 10 years now.
And do you put that same focus on writing as a career?
Yeah, I do. Because at a university, when you take creative writing classes, you're going to get lots of craft discussion. And I try to do craft discussion, but you're going to get, very little real-world professional advice. And so I tried to give the real-world professional advice because I'm the one who can give it. I did actually have a grad student host all my lectures online last year. It was part of a project for another class. And so if you go to writeaboutdragons.com, I think that's what it is. He posted all of those, just YouTube videos. And so you can see what my lectures are like.
And I understand that BYU actually has its own science fiction magazine. Have you had any involvement with that?
Yeah, I was editor of that for a couple of years. So it's a semi-prozine. It was started by the same group who took that first class 20 years ago, or plus now. We call them the class that wouldn't die. They continued on meeting, started their own writing group, started up The Leading Edge, which is the magazine, and then just handed down from student to student from then on that they just kept doing it. It's a fun magazine. Taught me a lot about publishing and about writing, actually, because nothing teaches you about writing faster, I feel, than reading other people's horrible work and realizing it's much like your own, and you need to be doing stuff better than that.
So it seems like most of the writers that I know are either naturally short story writers or naturally novelists, and you definitely fall into the latter category.
I do.
And just listening to you talk, I was actually wondering, have you written more published short stories or unpublished novels?
Definitely more unpublished novels, yeah. Because short stories, if you use the technical definition of short story, I think I've actually only ever written one, because everything I write goes into the least novelette length. I wrote one for Charlaine Harris. She wanted a story for me for an anthology that sounded like a lot of fun, games dead people play. And so I wrote an actual short story for her, because that's just how it came out, and sent it to her. But everything else I've done is novelette or novella. I really like novellas. I love reading novellas. I love writing novellas because they really are just short novels, right? You do all of the sort of things you do for a novel, but you do them in a short form. Whereas a short story is a completely different art. It's the difference between learning to drive down the green and to putt, right? You're using similar tools, but there's so much difference there that becoming a good short story writer takes a lot of work in different ways. And I'm very naturally a novelist, but I can apply a lot of my same skills to the novella form, and have been very pleased with how some of my novellas have turned out because of that.
So you want to just tell us a little bit about some of the short fiction that you've written?
Sure. I had 2 novellas come out this year. One is called Legion. I did that one with Subterranean Press. And it was me trying my hand at some more thriller-esque modern-day things. It's about a camera's invented that can take pictures of the past, and it gets stolen. And a very interesting individual gets hired to track it down. His name's Stephen Leeds. And I came up with this idea for someone that was a genius and who could read up on a subject and become an expert at it in a very short amount of time. But in order to store all this information in his brain, what he does is he creates this hallucination, another person, who is actually a repository for that information, that then follows him around and gives him advice in those situations. So if he wants to learn a new language, he can study it, and this person will appear next to him who becomes his interpreter in that language. And he doesn't actually speak it. He runs into people who have to have his hallucinatory, his figment, as he calls them, interpreter, translate for him so that he can understand and things like that. It was just a wacky, fun idea. So that's Legion. The other one that I have, I'm really proud of, and if you've never tried any of my work, the thing I would suggest would probably be this. It's called The Emperor's Soul, and it's the story of a woman who uses forgery magic, who is hired to create a forgery of the Emperor's soul magically because he's been wounded in the head, he's brain dead. There's just a shell left there, and the people who are keeping him in power want to have a forged soul placed into him so that no one will know that he's been wounded, and so they can keep on ruling the empire.
I understand you've also had some stories in some of the fine anthologies edited by John Joseph Adams.
Have. In fact, John has two of my shorter works. One is one of these interludes from the First Way of Kings, and it stood fairly well on his own. We just named it after the character Risen, and it's in John's anthology Epic. And in fact, John, the scene that I recorded is actually a new interlude with Risen for the second. So that's pretty cool. I suppose that could be publicity for Epic if you want it to be. I've also got a story that I co-wrote with a friend of mine in Armored, the anthology. And that's a very fun story that I co-authored. Again, I don't have the military expertise. I wanted to write this military science fiction story. And so I went to a friend in the military who's also a writer, and we did the story together.
All right, cool. And so then in addition to writing, you also are the co-host of the Writing Excuses podcast, which is a podcast for writers. And John was just telling me that Mary Robinette Kowal actually flies from Chicago to Utah just to tape the show.
Yeah. The podcast is successful enough. We have an Audible sponsorship that we can actually afford airfare and things like that, which is pretty cool. And so we fly Mary in because Skype is a wonderful tool, works great for an interview like this, but when it's a show that you really need the energy of the hosts together, and that's kind of part of what we focus on for that. We need to be there in person, we find. So we do it in person.
Could you talk, what are some recent topics or guests or whatever that you've covered?
Let's see. Right now we've got 4 ways the industry is changing. How to write a secret history, kind of a subset of alternate history. We've got one where we had listeners send us in questions and we answer the questions. We do things like, what are your embarrassing early projects? How do you tell if your idea is too big for the story you're working on? How do you avoid discouragement? How do you handle multiple magic systems in one book? And then we have a few before that where we brainstorm stories together and then talk about how we would outline them and things like that. So there's all sorts of things on there. We've had a lot of editors and other writers on as guests. We've broken down all kinds of writing topics from outlining to how to do characters and all these different things. So yeah, if you're interested in writing, go look it up. There's a ton of archives. I think we're starting our 8th season, I think, or something like that. So
I saw you're also starting up a writer's retreat called Out of Excuses.
Yeah, this is Mary suggested this to do a writing retreat. People have been asking about doing this, and I like to try to do one thing like this every year. In the past, I've been doing one that Kevin J. Anderson did, which is called Superstars Writing Seminars, and this one I wanted to try doing something a little more hands-on with some students. So Mary's parents have a vacation home next to their actual home, I think, or like they own 2 houses. I don't even know how it works. You'd have to ask Mary. But anyway, they rent it out for vacationing and things like this, and we are going to be renting it and holding a seminar in it where we will meet with listeners and we will all write together and hopefully record some episodes of Writing Excuses and to help people out.
And can people still apply to that, or is it all sold?
It's sold out in like 9 minutes. Maybe in a future year. But yeah, I think it was actually 9 minutes. So, I mean, there's only like 20 spaces for it, so it went really fast.
And so you've also been involved recently with the Waygate Charitable Foundation. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, Waygate is a foundation run by Wheel of Time fans. Number of the Wheel of Time organizations, fandom organizations, have long been involved and have a good history with charitable work. And recently they decided that if they were going to be doing this and having the amount of money kind of flow through and toward charities that they were doing, they should make it official tax-wise. They actually started a company, made it a nonprofit, did all the things they needed to do. I've been working on them. They put me on the board, and this year we've been recently been focusing on World Builders, Pat Rothfuss's charity, which is a fantastic charity for Heifer International. Buys llamas and things for people in developing countries, and teaches them how to take care of them so they can sustain themselves off of the livestock that they're given and things like that. It's a fantastic charity, and so we've been working with that to try and do some good where we can.
All right, great. And so then just to wrap things up, are there any other new or upcoming projects that you'd like to mention?
Last book of the Wheel of Time. Otherwise, I'm hard at work on Stormlight 2. That's actually been my focus for the last 5 or 6 months, ever since I finished the last Wheel of Time book, and it'll continue to be my focus following the tour that I'm doing. I do also have a couple of projects that I started working on in years ago before the Wheel of Time came my way, and which I had to put on hold until now. And both of them are YA books that I've written. One's called The Arithmetist. It's coming out from Tor in the summer. And then in late summer, I've got one called Steelheart, which is a really awesome superhero apocalypse sort of book that's coming out from Random House.
All right, great. So Brandon Sanderson, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thank you guys for having me.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Brandon Sanderson for joining us on the show. And as some of you may know, early in his career, Robert Jordan actually wrote a number of Conan the Barbarian novels. And so we thought now might be a good time to do a little retrospective on the various films that have been adapted from the works of Conan's creator, Robert E. Howard. So this is similar to the survey of Philip K. Dick movie adaptations that we did back in episode 68. And especially since it was just announced that Arnold Schwarzenegger will be reprising his role as Conan in the upcoming film, The Legend of Conan. And of course, we couldn't talk about all this stuff without calling upon the expertise of the biggest Conan fan we know, Douglas Cohen. He's the former editor of Realms of Fantasy magazine, and his short fiction has appeared in magazines such as Interzone and Weird Tales. And he and John are also co-editing the upcoming anthology Oz Reimagined, New Tales from the Emerald City and Beyond. So Doug, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me back.
And so I think just first of all, I'd like to start out and just talk a little bit about who Robert E. Howard was, and talk about the film The Whole Wide World, starring Vincent D'Onofrio, which is about the life of Robert E. Howard. So basically, Robert E. Howard grew up in a small town in Texas. He lived most of his life in a town called Cross Plains, Texas, and grew up around cowboys and prospectors, and listened to a lot of ghost stories and heard stories about the Indian Wars and stuff like that. And so he developed this fascination with tough guys and adventure stories and ghost stories and all these sorts of things. And he was a very sensitive, bright kid, and just didn't really fit in at all in Cross Plains, Texas, and wrote a lot of poetry and kind of got interested in bodybuilding and amateur boxing and stuff like that as a teenager, and lived with his parents his whole life and wrote stories for pulp magazines, mostly Weird Tales, I think. And he wrote all sorts of, it wasn't just Conan the Barbarian, he wrote all kinds of different stories, all kinds of different adventure stories and historical stories and things like that. And this movie, The Whole Wide World, it kind of covers the period. It's actually based, he sort of briefly dated a woman named Novelyn Price, who was an aspiring writer. Her friends just introduced her to Howard because he was just sort of known as the only writer around. And so they hung out. I guess there wasn't a lot to do in Cross Plains, Texas, so they mostly, it seems, just kind of drove around and talked. And she wrote a pair of books about those years that were turned into this film. And then Howard had always been close to his mother. And when it was announced that she had fallen into a coma from which she was not expected to awaken, he went out to his car and shot himself with a pistol. And so this movie, I think, is quite good. Vincent D'Onofrio sort of, I think, captures this sort of the sensitive guy in this big, intimidating body that Robert E. Howard was. And for example, Robert E. Howard would apparently, as he was writing his stories, he would sort of declaim them out, to himself as he was writing, and there's a scene where one of the characters kind of peeks in a window at him and just sees him furiously typing and shouting out the story, this very bold adventure story that he's writing as he's doing it. And I guess I forgot to mention that he was also a correspondent with H.P. Lovecraft, and that he included a bunch of Lovecraftian elements in his stories.
He was also correspondence with Clark Ashton Smith at the time. You know, they were like the big three during those days. All the pulp writers, they were swapping a lot of letters with each other.
And it's worth noting, too, that like Lovecraft, none of Robert E. Howard's work was ever collected in ever published in book form in his lifetime. And like Lovecraft, he didn't have a very high literary profile at the time of his death, but has gone on to have lots of fans and academic attention and studies and all this stuff. I read one by Don Herron called The Dark Barbarian, which was very, very good and very, very interesting, and argued, I thought pretty persuasively, that Robert E. Howard's prose style was a lot better than people generally give it credit for. People will, I think, criticize Howard's prose style for being careless, but it does have this incredible exuberance and passion and energy, and he writes action very, very well.
Regardless of whether or not you're actually a fan of the type of stories Robert E. Howard wrote, The Whole Wide World is just a flat-out good movie. So even if you don't have any interest in it at all, it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you're interested in writers and writing.
The one sort of criticism I have of it is not really the filmmaker's fault, but what happens in real life is that the woman whose memoirs it's based on, Evelyn Price, she went off to school, I think, and so she wasn't actually around when Howard killed himself. And, if you were writing the story, you would want something more dramatic to happen at the ending.
You can definitely make a case that Conan was the epitome of what Robert E. Howard would have liked to be. He would have liked to have been this supremely confident man around women. He had long, letters with H.P. Lovecraft where they discussed barbarism versus civilization, and that was a big theme in all the Conan stories. And, Howard always argued that the natural state of mankind is the barbarian. And even if he didn't, in his absolute core, want to be a barbarian, he was extremely curious. What would it be like to live in that age? So he projected a lot of that stuff through Conan, his other characters to a lesser extent, but particularly Conan.
I guess we should explain that the Conan stories are set, it's on our Earth in the past, but it's this whole epic that's completely forgotten. And this is sort of described by Howard most famously in the opening paragraph of his first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword. I have that here. I'm just going to read that quickly. Know, O Prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Numidia, Ophir, Berthunia, Hyperborea, Zamora with its dark-haired women and towers of spider-haunted mystery, Zingara with its chivalry, Koth that bordered on the pastoral lands of Shem, Stygia with its shadow-guarded tombs, Hyrcania whose riders wore steel and silk and gold. But the proudest kingdom of the world was Aquilonia, reigning supreme in the dreaming west. Hither came Conan the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. And so when they filmed Conan the Barbarian, they actually sort of included rewrite a little sort of summary version of that to open up the movie. But so let's talk about this first Conan the Barbarian movie that made Arnold Schwarzenegger a star. See, John, you said surprisingly there were some things you actually liked about this. Why don't we open up with that? What did you actually like about this movie?
So, there's not a whole lot that I like about the movie, obviously, but, I think there are some cool things about it. Admittedly, not cool enough that it could possibly warrant 77% on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't know. I would have to guess that anybody who's rating it highly on Rotten Tomatoes must be, thinking of it oh, I remembered that movie in the 80s. That was awesome. And they haven't tried to watch it now because, it doesn't hold up very well. I don't know. It's kind of just easy to watch and half pay attention to, and but it's like there's action like almost throughout the whole movie, and it's like, I mean, the action's not all that great, like in terms of like if you compare it to a movie made now, like in terms of the swordplay and everything, it's not all that believable. That's it. It's not a good movie, but it's I've sat through much worse movies. That's
Yeah, so this is what you get when you ask
say.
John for the positive aspects of a movie.
Right.
Is that what we call a backhanded compliment?
Okay, well,
it's the only compliment I know how to make.
All right, I'll tell you some of the things I liked about the movie. Although I honestly fell asleep in the middle of it. But,
that was your favorite part.
But I liked the snake cult. The plot, we should basically say, the plot of this movie is basically Conan versus a snake cult, and he and some accomplices are tasked to rescue some king or something's daughter who's fallen under the sway of this snake cult. And just the idea, that there's this snake cult and they're sacrificing people to this giant snake, and that people are so wrapped up in this cult that they want to go back to it. They want to sacrifice themselves to the giant snake. All that stuff I think is just really creepy and cool. I liked the character of Valeria, that she's a very capable female character. You might expect all the women to just be, wenches or whatever. But Valeria, I thought, was a very strong, capable character, an interesting character. And there's just there's a sort of weird auteur quality to this movie that you wouldn't expect. There's like really long shots. The part where James Earl Jones, who's the head of the snake cult, he chops off the head of Conan's mother when Conan is a child. And just the way it's shot, it keeps cutting to close-ups of James Earl Jones's eyes, and I don't know, just throughout the movie, there's this weird languorousness to the way it's shot that you wouldn't expect from an action movie like this. But so Doug, what do you think of this movie? And is the snake cult, is that from the Conan stories?
Well, the snake cult is really more from the Kull stories, and Kull's world is supposed to have, same universe, but thousands of years earlier, then a cataclysm happened. And then you have the Hyborian Age when they rise up from the remnants of that cataclysm. But it was all interconnected between the Serpent Men of Kull's time and the worshippers of Set, because Set is definitely part of Conan's world. What I liked about the movie, I think the most obvious thing is I actually think that the score for the movie, the musical score, is great. It really captures the world. Now, if I wasn't a big Conan fan, I'll be honest, I might have a very different take on the movie. But like I said, Conan was my introduction to this stuff. So I was watching this movie as a kid religiously. I watched it over and over and over. So it has a fond place in my heart. Although I will admit, as a kid, I used to get annoyed. I'm like, how could they make Arnold Schwarzenegger Conan? Conan has black hair. Conan has blue eyes. What is this? But actually, I look back now, I'm like, yeah, okay, muscle-bound barbarian, Schwarzenegger's good for this. But also, of all the different Robert E. Howard movies, and let's take Whole Wide World out of that, I would say of all of them, this is the one that tries the closest to capture the spirit of Conan the Barbarian, as, Robert E. Howard wrote it. Because more than any other movie, it draws on, the original stories and the mythology. There's a scene where you see Conan being crucified, and there's a vulture trying to eat him. That's actually from a story called A Witch Shall Be Born.
In the original story, does he also kill the vulture by biting it when it's trying to eat him?
Yes, he does, and
that's awesome.
It is awesome. When you just say that in an interview like this, and if you haven't read the story and you don't know Conan, when I say don't know Conan, everyone's heard of Conan, but if you don't know the stories, you almost want to roll your eyes and you hear that, oh, he's crucified and he bites a vulture and kills it. It sounds a little ridiculous, but that was one of Robert E. Howard's strengths, was just the narrative energy that he would bring to his stories. You were almost willing to believe things that were otherwise impossible.
Well, actually, I'll tell you something else. I really liked actually the part where they go to bust out the woman from the snake cult, and there's the big orgy, and they're ladling the soup, and you see a human hand float to the surface. There's a sort of over the top quality to this movie that is just, it's just interesting. It's sort of, I guess it's a match for Howard's writing, that they're all in on this one.
Exactly, because like Howard's Conan stories, they were over the top, but like he believed in what he was writing at the same time. And they tried to bring that to the original movie. It was over the top, but it was taking itself seriously at the same time. They weren't making a mockery of themselves by making it over the top.
And also I liked that it didn't end with a big climactic battle, which every single movie does. It's this sort of weird psychological confrontation between Conan and James Earl Jones. Okay, but I mean, Doug, you mentioned that Arnold Schwarzenegger doesn't fit your idea of Conan because he has the wrong eye color and hair color and stuff, but there's no indication, right, in Howard's stories that Conan wears a loincloth and nothing else, right? I mean, that's an invention of this movie, or is it Frank Frazetta's Conan artwork where that comes from, or where does that idea of the barbarian who wears no clothes come from?
Honestly, it depended on the story. Sometimes Conan might be in a loincloth with nothing but his sword and some sandals and boots. And other times he might be in full armor. But, when you hear barbarian, I guess, for whatever reason, I guess that fed into the iconic image of what people think Conan is. And I think Frank Frazetta's illustrations had something to do with that. The Marvel comics had something to do with that, because those were really popular for a long time. And that's usually how they illustrated Conan. And the movies had something to do with it. And after a while, unless you had read the source material, you kind of just assumed that's Conan. And, for the same reasons, people started just assuming he was a big, stupid, muscle-bound barbarian. And the truth is, he had intelligence. When he's younger, he doesn't understand the ways of civilization, but he was never really stupid. If you pay attention to all the stories, there is no common tongue in Robert E. Howard's world that I can recall. If there is, all these countries still have their own languages, and he'll be speaking Nemedi in one story. He'll be speaking Zamorian in one story. He was filling in the map as king in Phoenix on the Sword, saying, these areas, it's a little fuzzy. And that's the first time you ever meet him. So, what the character that Conan actually is versus the character that people think of, two very different things.
Mm-hmm. And he's as much sort of a thief and an acrobat as just a brawler, right?
That was another thing that, Robert E. Howard did with his stories. He skipped around in Conan's life. There was no chronology that he laid out. First story he wrote, he's a king. Then, he could be a thief here. He could be a pirate here. He could be a mercenary, the captain of the king's guards. He was leading, the desert tribesmen on raids. Robert E. Howard really took that to the extreme. He made Conan do everything.
All right, so after this movie was such a big hit, they decided to make another Conan movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger called Conan the Destroyer.
And now things start going really downhill.
So, John, what do you think of
If you don't mind my saying.
Oh, wait, John, you didn't watch this, right?
I have seen it, but I didn't rewatch it in preparation for this. Largely because I had a limited amount of time to watch all the movies, but also because I remembered how terrible it was and I couldn't really bring myself to watch it again.
So what do you remember about it?
Oh, I remember very little except that it was just not a good movie. But I remember there's isn't there a climactic scene where there's he's going to fight a wizard or something, and there's a hall of mirrors or something like that?
That's in the middle of the movie, but yeah.
Oh, is that in the middle? Okay. I mean, that's really the only thing I actually really remember about it. I mean, I'm sure if you guys start talking about it, I'll remember parts of it.
Yeah, I mean, so in Conan the Destroyer, a nasty queen sends Conan on a quest to sort of ferry her niece, I think it is, to this castle, this magic castle, where she needs to retrieve some magic item. And in this castle, Conan has to fight a wizard, and then they get this magic item. Conan's picked up a bunch of sidekicks by this point, including Wilt Chamberlain and Grace Jones. And
oh, Grace Jones was in that one. Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
She's sort of a Zulu warrior kind of character. And there's this thief guy and a wizard.
Oh, I hate that thief.
Yeah, he's sort of the comic relief. He's really annoying. And then they finally retrieve this other magic item, which is a horn that's going to bring this statue of a god to life. The statue god is called Dagoth. Very obvious Lovecraftian homage there. and then the statue turns into a Lovecraftian monster, and Conan and his buddies have to kill it. Yeah, and this one, it's much more cliche. It's much more comic. It's not taking itself seriously at all, and it's just not very good.
Dave, you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I saw the story when they were doing the opening credits. The story was by Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway, and I thought that was a sign of good things to come, because Roy Thomas, he did the Conan the Barbarian comics early on, and all the fans loved him. And Jerry Conway had actually done the Kull comics for Marvel, so I thought this was going to be an awesome story. And maybe it was before Hollywood got its hands on it. Who knows? But I don't know. The most I could say is that the score was decent. You mentioned something about the thief was comic relief, and he was really annoying, and he was. And for some reason, they decided, hey, let's make this a lot funnier and a lot more campy. Problem is, that's not Conan. And it created a weird juxtaposition of you're fighting these grim creatures and this dangerous magic. Oh, but let's throw in a little humor now and again, just for the hell of it. Yes, Howard mentions that Conan had gigantic mirth. But that was just if he's throwing down a horn of ale or something, he's willing to make a joke, or he could appreciate a good joke under the right circumstances. I think Conan would have been more likely to smash that thief in the face with his fist and be like, Crom, I can't listen to this guy anymore. The scene with the mirrors that John remembers, it's interesting to note that that's actually one of the few scenes that comes from an original Conan story. It's been completely reinvented, but that was Rogues in the House by Robert E. Howard. And there was a creature, a not quite man, not quite ape, but some kind of beast between creature in a red robe, and he's seen through some mirrors. I think of the Frazetta covers. I think the first Frazetta cover actually features Conan fighting that creature, and it has the red robe. But it was cliche top to bottom. The wizard was called Tothamon. You really had to change the name from Thoth Amon, who's probably among Robert E. Howard fans the most famous Conan villain. Heart of Ahriman, which is the jewel they had to get. That's from the one Conan novel that Robert E. Howard ever wrote. But, it was completely different in the novel. And just all this other stuff it was pretty awful.
Special effects today, people will often say, oh, the computer graphics they look so fake. And why don't they go back to practical effects? And I think that these movies are really a reminder of practical effects are not necessarily a solution to the problem of monsters looking fake on screen.
No arguments here.
All right, so from Conan the Destroyer, I'm afraid we're gonna have to move to Red Sonja.
Do we have to?
We can make this. Hopefully, we can make this short. I mean, this is Doug, tell us about Red Sonja. Is that a Howard character?
Robert E. Howard did create a character called Red Sonja. The movie features a Red Sonja with flame red hair, and her last name, it's Sonja. All the way back in the 1930s, Robert E. Howard created a female warrior with flame red hair. She was called Red Sonja, but instead of a J, there was a Y, and it wasn't in Conan's world. It was early 1600s, late 1500s, right around that time period. And it wasn't fantasy. It was a story called Shadow of the Vulture, and it was just historical fiction with a lot of action infused into it. He had one story published about her. That was pretty much it. And then years later, in the Conan the Barbarian comic, Roy Thomas, the writer, and Barry Windsor Smith, they reinvented that character to the Red Sonja that most people know, and decided, let's create another female warrior for Conan to play off of. And he just Thomas thought that the J was more exotic, so he changed the Y in Sonja's name to a J. And that's the Red Sonja that people know now. They gave her an entirely new origin. She was actually very popular in the comics. Now she's not even with Marvel Comics anymore. She's a really popular character with Dynamite Comics now, although I haven't read any of those.
Yeah, and so this movie it's sort of like a parody of what a cluelessly sexist Hollywood director would make, right?
You're almost being nice.
I mean, just the backstory, just to give you a sample, is that a lesbian queen tries to seduce Red Sonja, and when Sonja rebuffs her, the queen has her soldiers gang rape Red Sonja, and then Sonja spends the rest of the movie getting herself into trouble, and Arnold Schwarzenegger continually comes to her rescue, and he eventually tells her, "You thought you could handle things without a man, but obviously you were wrong." And she says, "Yes, I was wrong." And he explains how he was sent to help her. And she says, "Oh, I thought there was some other reason you were following me around all the time." And he says, "Oh, there was." And he grabs her and just starts making out with her. So that kind of gives you the level of enlightenment of this movie. Arnold Schwarzenegger, I mean, the character, he's not called Conan in this movie.
Prince Calidor.
I heard a rumor that he was supposed to be Conan originally, but they decided that this movie was so bad that they changed his name because they didn't want its infection spreading to the Conan franchise.
Dave, you should share that quote we were talking about that Arnold Schwarzenegger said about this movie.
Yeah. So Arnold Schwarzenegger describes this as the worst movie he was ever in, and says that if his kids misbehave, he threatens to make them watch this movie, and that straightens him out right away.
And that's my favorite thing about Red Sonja.
Yeah, there's nothing good to say about this one. So why don't we move along to Conan the Barbarian 2011. This was sort of a remake in 3D with Jason Momoa, who played Khal Drogo in Game of Thrones.
I had zero expectations for this, and I actually liked it a lot more than I thought it would. I mean, not that I liked it, but I mean, it wasn't as bad as I had feared. I actually thought it had some promise right at the beginning. Like, I thought the opening part was kind of cool, but like I didn't want Conan to grow up. I wanted to watch a movie like with Conan as a kid and his dad Ron Perlman, because like that part seemed kind of cool. Mm-hmm. But then he grows up and becomes Khal Drogo, and I was like, that guy did okay as Khal Drogo, but like, if he's speaking in English, like, I don't know, he doesn't quite have the acting chops to speak in English. Like, give him a fake language to say stuff in, and then he's okay.
Okay, well, I just want to agree with you that the part where he's a kid, I thought was good. I really liked, they send, there's this sort of challenge where the kids are supposed to run a loop through the woods with an egg in their mouth, and whoever makes it back first with the egg unbroken wins. And so the kids are all jostling each other and trying to, cause each other to break the egg and so on. And Conan has forced his way into this contest, even though he's really too young to be there. And then they get attacked by crazy forest-dwelling people, and all the other kids run away, and Conan keeps going on the designated course, and he walks back into the village holding the decapitated heads of 4 of these forest dwellers, and then spits out the egg, which is still whole. That was good. I really liked that.
I didn't mind the opening, but I was just a little annoyed that, okay, you're starting over with Conan the Barbarian, and oh my God, because then I saw where they went with it. It's really, you're going to do another origin story about Conan where he wants vengeance for his father against a sorcerer, even though none of the Robert E. Howard stories ever gave an origin about Conan, and that was intentional. Conan is like a character that springs full-blown onto the page, kind of like how Christopher Nolan wanted the Joker to spring full-blown onto the screen in The Dark Knight. He didn't want an origin story.
Okay, but we do know that Conan was born on a battlefield, right?
Yeah, you hear little bits like that, but it was just like, really, again, with the same overarching outline of a plot. Conan never had this grand quest in life. So I did think there was some cool stuff. It was just, are you really going to make him seek vengeance against a sorcerer again?
Actually, I thought that part was really cool too, though, that his mother was pregnant and she gets stabbed, and so she's got to have, they've got to have the baby right then. I mean, the whole scene is like completely like ludicrous in terms of realism there, because it's like Ron Perlman's like staring into her eyes, and he sort of cuts into her stomach blindly and pulls the child out, and suddenly it's born, But I mean, it's like a cool scene. It's a cool idea that he's battle born. He's actually cut from the womb on a battlefield. Like I like that idea, and I mean that whole I still like regardless of the Conan backstory, I don't have the attachment like Doug does. So I mean I'm just watching it as a movie, and I don't care what they're doing with it. And from that point of view, like I think, for all the reasons that you mentioned, Dave, like, I mean, I think the opening works really well. And then, but also I just think like Ron Perlman was great. And I wish he was in the movie longer, but obviously it's a story about Conan, not about his dad. So
to be fair, I did think that there were good set pieces in that. I like the costumes, and I actually thought Jason Momoa, I thought he was a really good choice for Conan. You could see as I got older, I got over the whole blue-eyed thing. And I thought his performance was fine for what Conan is. I just thought it was a weak script. I also wasn't crazy about the Conan's main love interest in this story because they really didn't know what they wanted to do with this character. Like in the original Conan stories, either Conan was saving the damsel in distress or he was fighting alongside some warrior woman. And in this one, half the time she's screaming, "Save me, Conan," and the other half the time suddenly she's wielding a sword. They made her like a damsel in distress, but when she had to wield a sword because the story called for it, it's like, oh, okay, but now she can kick some butt.
Well, this movie I think what's disappointing about it is not on its own merits. On its own merits, I think it's okay, whatever. But that it's a remake of the original Conan the Barbarian, which I think is so much less tepid than this one. I mean, this one just feels much more pro forma. It's just like a typical Hollywood action movie kind of. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really do anything interesting. I was reading actually, one of the characters in the movie is this sort of witch girl, played by Rose McGowan. And she said that there's this one scene where she kind of tries to seduce her father. And in this interview, Rose McGowan said that she really wanted to do more with that, and that the executives were just like totally freaked out by that and didn't want to touch that at all. And I think that's just symptomatic of, again, the tepidness of this movie, that it doesn't do anything crazy. It doesn't do anything shocking. It's just, that is this movie.
That scene actually bothers me, and not even because she tried to seduce her father. I mean, okay, I'm not endorsing that by any means, but if you want to have something that's edible, or if you want to call it an electric complex going on, that's fine. But it was almost like a red herring that they even put that in there because, like you said, nothing else happens with that. So why even put it in? It sets up like a false expectation.
As tepid as it is, and overall, I agree, it definitely is a tepid film. Overall, I'm really surprised that it's only got like a 23% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I mean, because compare that to Conan the Destroyer, which is at 30%, and Red Sonja, which is at 19%. It's like there's no way that this movie is actually only 4% better than Red Sonja. And comparing it to 77% approval on the original Conan the Barbarian, which is like, I mean, Conan the Barbarian, the remake, like I wouldn't have rated it much lower. I mean, because it's like, it's bad in different ways, but I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like, as an enjoyable film, like, I don't know, like, I think I probably had more fun watching the remake just because, like, at least I could enjoy the action sequences because, like, they had better production values and, like, they were more full of action, as opposed to the original, which, like, being made so many years ago, it's like, it just doesn't look all that convincing on screen.
Well, one thing I did like about this is that speaking of the action scenes, is that I really think for an action scene to be successful these days, the character has to do something clever. If there's just a sword fight, if Conan just fights a guy with a sword and then he wins, you're like, oh, I guess he was stronger than that guy. Like, who cares? It's not interesting at all. And this movie did have some kind of clever things. I thought they could have been done better. But for example, Conan's friend is in a cage with a chain on it underwater. And so he wraps the chain around a guard and shoves it into the tentacled monster, which pulls the guard down under the water, lifting the cage out of the water. Like, that's good stuff. That's a good action set piece right there. And also at the end that Conan, I guess spoiler warning, Conan is, I guess it's not that much of a spoiler, but he defeats the main bad guy in the same way that his father
had defeated. Shocker.
But he defeats the main bad guy in the same way that his father had defeated him as a child. Stuff like that was clever. And if it had just been kind of finessed a little bit more, it could have, could have been a pretty good movie.
I think I probably would have liked the movie more if they didn't try and make it a remake.
I mean, I kind of thought that's what they did. I mean, it kind of seemed to me more like it was a reboot rather than a remake. Because it doesn't really have much in common with the original.
Right, but they did have like something called the Mystery of Steel in this early on, which is like definitely a weak allusion to the riddle of steel in the original movie, which was like a big thing with James Earl Jones as the sorcerer trying to learn the riddle of steel, and then he tells Conan, no, it's flesh that is the most powerful. So it's like, it was like they were sticking their toe in the water, but why even bother? Just just go in a new direction. There are so many different adventures that Conan could have given the varied life that Robert E. Howard gave him. So why would you want to like have something that makes you think of something else?
So Doug, I mean, you're sort of suggesting, right, that these Conan films are only kind of weakly inspired by the written material. Now, is that because the written material just wouldn't translate well the way it is to film, or are they just screwing it up? And are there like Conan stories they should just take and film them basically the way they're written?
I think it'd be hard to like film most of these Conan stories exactly the way they're written, just because, you know, Robert E. Howard only wrote one full-length Conan novel in his life. And even then, it was a pretty short novel. So, I mean, even if you like just took one story and said, we want to translate this story for the movie, you would have to flesh it out. But I think that aside, you know, Conan, it was more than just, you know, fighting monsters and, you know, a sorcery. There was one, like I said, that theme of civilization versus barbarism. The closest they came with any of these was the first one. And on top of that, just there was a reason H.P. Lovecraft liked Conan's stuffs, like Robert E. Howard's stuff so much. One of the big reasons was how much horror that Robert E. Howard would infuse into his stories. You know, he tried to like really give a certain primal fear into the creatures. Now, I'm not saying as a kid I was scared when I was reading it, but there was a certain level of originality to the way he presented his creatures. And something that fails to translate in these movies is the way Robert E. Howard wrote. You know, his narrative energy is really what drew so many people into his stories, and why you hear so many sword and sorcery authors say there'll never be another Conan. Robert E. Howard had some unique visions, and I'm dubious that anyone's ever going to be able to properly translate them.
All right, so we also have two non-Conan feature films that have come out supposedly based on Robert E. Howard stories. First up, we've got Kull the Conqueror. And this one, it just seems to me like an episode of Hercules: The Legendary Journeys. It's very hard for me to believe this has anything to do with Robert E. Howard stories. I haven't read the Kull stuff, but Doug, does this have anything to do with Robert E. Howard?
Next to nothing. Actually, the first Conan movie, the original one, probably had more to do with Kull than this one. Like the sorcerer Thulsa Doom, that was a sorcerer from an unpublished Kull story. And we already talked about, I think, the Serpent Cult. That was like from the Kull stories. It was awful. You know, I think like the producers must have decided really early on, let's make this as much like Hercules as possible. So all the Kevin Sorbo fans will talk about how great this is, because it's not much better than Red Sonja. The only reason you can even say it's better than Red Sonja is because I guess there isn't like a whole group of people that will be offended by it, except maybe movie viewers, but that goes for Red Sonja too.
I mean, it just looked like a TV show. I mean, what was who made this movie? Like, what was the budget? I mean, I don't even understand where this came from.
You know, it was definitely like a major release, because I remember going to see this in the theater, and the idea that it was or that it was geared towards, you know, capturing the Hercules fans, I can definitely see that, because, you know, I must have been watching Hercules when the movie came out, because otherwise, why did I go see it? You know. But although I have to say that's about all I remember about the movie, is that I went to go see it in the theater. I don't remember much about it otherwise. Although I think Tia Carrere is in it, right?
Yeah, Kull gets made king, and Tia Carrere casts a spell on him to make him marry her, but she's actually an evil witch, and you know, she steals his throne, and then he has to come back and kill her and get it back.
Yeah, I mean, this movie had blatant disrespect for, like, Robert E. Howard's mythology. Like, Tia Carrere, she, like you said, she was a witch, and, like, they revived her, and she was from ancient Acheron, which, you know, if they read the stories, they would know that, you know, Kull was from Atlantis, and then, you know, the Hyborian Age followed, and Acheron came after Atlantis, and it was around the same time as Stygia, which was one of the Hyborian kingdoms. So, you know, it's just they threw everything out the window, and they basically just took the tiniest little bits of names and information, and they fudged together a really bad story.
All right, let's not waste any more time on this one.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so next up we got Solomon Kane. Doug, tell us about Solomon Kane, the Howard character.
Solomon Kane, like I said, I thought it was much more of a complex character than Robert E. Howard's Conan. He was an adventurer in the late 1500s, early 1600s, from Elizabethan England. He was a Puritan adventurer, and he basically saw himself as like an avenging angel of God, like not literally, but that's like the way he operated. He was out to eliminate evil, help those in distress. And that almost makes him sound kind of tepid and boring, except while Robert E. Howard never outright says it in the stories, it's completely obvious that Solomon Kane is insane. So, every time he thinks that he's killing in God's name, that's a crazy dude that's committing what he thinks is good acts in God's name. And, he is like fighting evil, but, he basically sees himself as judge, jury, and executioner. Even take the name Solomon Kane. You're working with two biblical names, Solomon, which, the great wise judge from ancient Jerusalem. And then you have Kane. While the spelling is different, you have the first murderer. So it's like just murder. So, he thinks he's giving just murders in the name of God. He's judge, jury, and executioner.
So wait, are they real witches that he's fighting in the stories?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. Thank you. It's like Elizabethan times, but there is sorcery in this world. He will fight witches, and there's a stretch where he journeys through like deep, dark, ancient, magic riddled Africa. So it's like, it has all the feel of sword and sorcery, except it's in a more recent era.
So he is fighting actual evil witches, but not with God's sanction? Is that what you're saying?
Think like a religious zealot almost, taken to the extreme, where it's like he's like a force of nature, and he's focused on doing certain acts, to like rid the world of evil, fight injustices, but just when you encounter this guy, his intensity, it's clear that he's not well.
It's good. It's good for the movie that the fantasy elements were actually present. Although I'm kind of disappointed because, like, when you were starting to describe it, I was like, oh, that sounds like actually even cooler. If in the 30s when Howard was writing, that he was writing this character that was actually just insane, and he was imagining that he was killing like these evil witches and stuff, but what he was really doing was just like murdering people. Like, that actually kind of sounds awesome and like subversive, like for the time period. Like, I would have liked to see that.
Yeah, what you're saying, John, that sounds pretty cool. And what Doug was saying, even if he's really fighting witches, but he's just like crazy, that's actually cool too. And actually knowing that that's the character in the fiction makes me like the movie a little bit less, because I wish they had done something more along those lines. But I don't know, John, what did you think of the movie just generally?
I enjoyed it. I don't think it's a good movie by any stretch, but and actually I would be tempted to sort of revise my opinion about what the best Howard movie is. This one certainly is in the running, I would think. I might have enjoyed it more than the original Conan, overall, because I think like it has the best action sequences, I think, by far. And it has good production values, and the acting's not too bad. Probably it might have the best acting. The guy who plays Solomon Kane's pretty good, but his whole body is like, all scarred up, and he's got like this big cross burned onto the back of onto his back, and it's like that all looked really cool, and it's got some semblance of a plot, and it kind of moves along pretty well at a good pace. It wasn't too bad. Again, it was the kind of movie that you could sort of tune out from and then tune back in and not really miss anything, but. And I don't know that I would have been able to get through it if I didn't have like my phone and I could like check Twitter and stuff, in between things. But it was not too bad as far as sort of dumb action movies go.
Yeah, I really like James Purefoy. He plays Solomon Kane. He plays Mark Antony in the HBO Rome series, and I think
that is him. Okay,
he's very, very good. The setup basically is that Solomon Kane has come to believe that he's this horrible guy. He does all this violent stuff, and then he has a change of heart. And then he comes to believe that if he engages in any more violence, the forces of hell will find him and drag him down to hell. And then he's put in a position where he has to do something violent. And that part was really affecting, I thought, where this little boy is in trouble and he's screaming, Solomon, kill these bad guys. I know you can do it. I know you can. And Solomon doesn't want to do it. And then, he's put in a position basically where he has to. And there's this weird shot where he looks up at heaven basically and says, is this all I am to you? So be it then. Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really interesting. The movie never really did anything with that afterward. But I wish it would have. I thought that was the most compelling part of the movie.
Yeah, it definitely had potential, and like that scene you mentioned, that was one of the best scenes, definitely. And I was also surprised actually, like, when they were holding the kid and trying to force him to act like that in that scene. They actually do kill the kid. I was surprised at that too. So that was an unexpected twist. I would have expected that he would have actually made his decision to go act before that happened.
Yeah, and it introduced this weird moral ambiguity to the whole situation where you're like, wait, should he have been more violent sooner? It's not as clear cut as most movies like this you would expect.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely with you guys. I thought James Purfoy gave a great performance. It's just the character he was portraying deviated a lot from what was in the books, because Solomon Kane in the beginning of the movie is, here's a sane guy that's knowingly committing evil, which is completely different from what Solomon Kane is in the books. So, good performance. I wasn't crazy about some of the choices on the interpretation of the character. The origin story, again, completely made up. And just like Conan, it's like, it's more interesting to me, like how these characters spring, full blown onto the page, and you don't know their past. And with Solomon Kane, I thought that was extra interesting because you don't know, was he born mentally imbalanced? Was there something that, clicked that set him over the edge? Howard fans talk about this and they debate it, but no one knows. And, he just kind of discarded that. Honestly, I think it's a lot easier to enjoy this movie if you haven't read the source material.
Sure. I'm sure that's true of all of these.
I think Solomon Kane in particular, you could almost walk away saying, hey, that wasn't half bad. Whereas Red Sonja, even if you don't know the source materials, you're going to say, that was awful. The same thing with Kull.
Yeah.
And this one actually, they had plans. This was supposed to be the first movie of a trilogy, assuming that this one made enough money.
Yeah, so what's the story on that? Do we know? Did it do well at all, or?
It doesn't look like it's made enough money, so I guess that's it.
No, it's kind of funny though. Like look at Conan the Barbarian and then the Conan reboot, and it's like, well, I mean, I can't imagine that made any money, and yet they're going right back to that Conan well already, and it's like, so it's just kind of funny how Hollywood they'll look at an example of something as oh well, we're never going to make anything like that again. And then on the other hand, they'll also look at, you'll have something like Conan. It's they'll keep going back to it no matter how many times it fails,
Well, speaking of that, John, did you hear that they're doing a Red Sonja remake?
What? No, really?
Yeah. Rose McGowan was actually supposed to be in it. I think she's out and somebody else is in, but I think Robert Rodriguez was supposed to do it. I'm not sure if he's still involved, but yeah, it's. I think it's scheduled even to come out before the new Arnold Schwarzenegger Conan movie.
Wow. Well, I mean, it couldn't be any worse, right?
I was about to say the same thing.
Although it doesn't really bode well for the budget of the project if they're talking about Rose McGowan starring. I mean, she's she's not exactly a top star and doesn't have a lot of name recognition really. So, although I guess with these kind of movies, it is hard to cast people. Although at least with Red Sonja, it's I would expect that they're probably not going to get somebody who's overly muscle bound. So it's not like you have to worry about that. Whereas with Conan, it's you're sort of very restricted because you need to find somebody who's very built.
I'll actually say that that's one nice thing I'll say about the Red Sonja movie is that physically the woman who plays Red Sonja looks like she could kick ass.
Yeah.
She's big and strong looking and is not just a typical Hollywood actress.
The drawback is that was some of the worst acting I ever saw. I mean, actually, I'm not even exaggerating. That movie is almost as bad as The Happening by M. Night Shyamalan.
I haven't seen Haywire yet, but Haywire is that action movie starring that female mixed martial arts wrestler or mixed
Gina Carano or something.
Yeah. So I mean, she's a mixed martial arts fighter, and she seems like the sort of person that could be good in that role. Just because she is an actual fighter. before they cast Jason Momoa, I mean, I was actually kind of thinking like The Rock would be a good fit for Conan.
No.
I mean, in terms of his personality and like the way he delivers lines and stuff, like I don't think he'd be good for Conan. But I mean, like he at least looks the part.
Well, but see, I don't even picture Conan as being like a big bodybuilder type, especially since there were no steroids in Hyboria.
Yeah.
He was kind of a He-Man, though, in the original stories, so, you know.
But there's like a special, you know what I'm saying? There's like a certain bodybuilder look that nobody in the ancient world would have had.
Mm-hmm.
And people say that Arnold Schwarzenegger actually had to lose muscle mass to play Conan because his biceps were so big, like he couldn't effectively swing a sword with them.
Oh, wow, that's hilarious. Well, anyway, like, I mean, if we take that muscle-bound restriction off, then it seems like we probably could have really cast a wider net and gotten somebody who's actually a pretty good actor rather than just somebody who looks good with, just a loincloth on or whatever.
All right, and speaking of looking good with a loincloth on, there's nothing I want to see more than 65-year-old Arnold Schwarzenegger in a loincloth next year. So what do you guys think about... It's actually going to be called The Legend of Conan.
It kind of makes sense just because at the end of the original Conan the Barbarian movie and at the end of Conan the Destroyer, they show Conan when he's older on his throne as Arnold Schwarzenegger. And they say, but that is another story. So, the Momoa Conan the Barbarian, that bombed. So it's like, what can we do to renew the franchise? Hey, Arnold Schwarzenegger isn't governor anymore.
They've actually been trying to make this for a while. I mean, they were planning to make it before he became governor, and that's stymied their plans. And then they had to make the Momoa version to, do something with the franchise that they paid all this money for and stuff.
I read somewhere that originally the Kull movie was supposed to be a Conan movie, and then they changed it to Kull because, or they got Kevin Sorbo because Schwarzenegger wouldn't do it, and then Kevin Sorbo, he didn't want to play a role where someone else had already played that role, so they changed the character from Conan to Kull. So it just became a steadily declining disaster.
I'm not terribly instilled with confidence with the idea that the Fast and Furious writer is writing the screenplay.
I will say I read an interview with that guy. I think it was that guy, and he was saying the right things as far as I'm concerned in terms of wanting it to be a story about an older Conan who's not pumped up on tons of steroids now, and he has to rely more on his wits and his guile, and that he's developed over a lifetime of adventures and stuff, and not just punching out camels and stuff,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think, I honestly, I had very low expectations, but if they were to do that right, that could be a really good movie.
I'd be excited if let's say they got Michael Moorcock to write the script, because as far as I'm concerned, he's the reigning living king of sword and sorcery, but that'll never happen because that makes too much sense. But
why get Michael Moorcock when you can get the guy who wrote Fast and Furious?
You got me with your legal mumbo jumbo, John.
All right, cool. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Doug, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks again for having me, guys.
And thanks again to Brandon Sanderson for being our guest today. Thanks as well to everyone who's written us 5-star reviews in iTunes, including Vinorvum in the US, Spinface 3000 and Borderer 3 in the UK, Brissy D in Canada, Murray NZ in New Zealand, Aseed Ed in the Netherlands, Serenity Home in Germany, and Eric Kalfis in Japan. And also a big thanks to Juan San Miguel for becoming subscriber number 38. To see a list of all our subscribers, visit our website at geeksguideshow.com and click on PayPal.
And remember to nominate all your favorite works for the Hugo Award. Geek's Guide is eligible for the Best Related Work category. I'm eligible for Best Editor. And all of the original fiction I published this year in my anthologies, or in Lightspeed or Nightmare, are all eligible in either the novelette or short story category. For more information, visit johnjosephadams.com and click on blog.
All right, so that was our show. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.